Grafton, New York, is the kind of hill town where twilight comes early. Pines crowd the road edges, shadows pool at the foot of mailboxes, and the air smells of stone and rain even on dry days. On the evening of Wednesday, June 18th, 2025, a call lit up the Rensselaer County 911 board from a house on South Road. A young woman sounded shaken but controlled. Her name was Whitney Fowler. She told the dispatcher there had been an altercation with her husband. Mid-sentence, the operator heard what every dispatcher dreads, sharp cracks, one, then another. That didn't sound like doors or dishes. The line went chaotic. Voices. A thump. Then nothing. State police and Rensselaer County deputies rolled toward the address, engines climbing and falling with the grade of the road. It's a sparsely populated stretch. Few streetlights, long gravel driveways, and the odd porch bulb haloed with moths. Patrols reported pulling up within minutes of the first call. Before they could even cross the threshold, a man stepped out from the shadows of the yard carrying a rifle. He was 26-year-old Joshua Fowler. Troopers say he refused commands to drop the weapon, pacing and yelling, as if daring the night to answer back. The moment stretched and training took over. Tasers snapped. The rifle hit the ground. Officers converged. What they found next was a home-turned crime scene in the span of a phone call. Outside, near the drive, Whitney lay mortally wounded. She was 27. Inside, two more family members had been shot and killed. Joshua's father, 55-year-old Wilson Fowler, and Joshua's grandmother, 69-year-old Anita Crandall. In the quiet after the sirens, a dog barked from somewhere down the road. The porch light flickered in the draft each time the front door opened and closed. Officers moving with that mix of speed and care you only see when a house holds both survivors and evidence. Neighbors would later describe hearing the sirens and thinking it had to be a medical call. Someone fallen, a heart episode, the usual rural emergencies. Instead, word traveled fast that 3 members of the Fowler family were gone, and Joshua had been taken into custody on the spot. By sunrise the next day, South Road was lined with yellow tape and quiet cars. Investigators went methodically, scene photographs, shell casings flagged, pathways gridded, body removal timed, so the medical examiner could note the position of each victim precisely the way they were found. The charges came quickly and were heavy. 1 count of first-degree murder and multiple counts of second-degree murder, plus a weapons charge. The rifle, authorities said, had been legally owned, kept in the home by Joshua's father. In the first appearance, shackled and silent, Joshua pleaded not guilty. He was remanded without bail to the Rensselaer County Jail. In the back and forth of arraignment, one phrase stuck like burrs to a wool coat: domestic. Not random, not a Ieska stranger. Violence that starts in whispers and ends in gunfire. When families and friends began to talk, a picture formed around Whitney that was larger than the last minutes of her life. Her father said she had raised concerns before, about control, about insults that curdled into threats, about the kind of abuse that doesn't always leave obvious marks, but leaves a person walking on eggshells in their own home. She'd kept details vague, the way people do when they're weighing risk. How much can I say without making tomorrow worse? Friends echoed it online. Whitney had confided she was planning to leave, that she had some money set aside, that help was being lined up. Those fragments now read like flares in the dark, signals you only realize were there after the storm. Troopers also acknowledged what reporters pressed them on. It wasn't the first time police had been called to that address. Years earlier, there had been domestic disturbance runs, 2018 and again in 2021. No arrests at those times, but enough to prove this home had a history. It's not unusual. Many homes do. The call, the walk away, the "we're fine now," the promise to try harder. Between those points sits the private calculus of fear and love that outsiders only dimly understand. What happened inside the house in the minutes before Whitney dialed 911 is the matter of motions and trial, but some things are already part of the record. Whitney reached for help. The line captured gunfire. When police arrived, Joshua was outside with a long gun. He survived the encounter. Officers chose tasers over bullets, and he will face a jury. Whitney did not survive. Neither did Wilson or Anita, elders who had a lifetime of mournings between them. A home that held 4 generations in different seasons, young marriage, middle-age compromise, grandmother wisdom, was emptied in a quarter hour. In the days that followed, the house drew the quiet pageantry that attends these cases. Bouquets on the mailbox post, a framed photo taped to the fence, a poster board with gel pen messages from neighbors who mostly waved in passing and now struggled to find a sentence big enough to hold the shock. Reporters stood at the end of the drive in the blue light of early evening, talking in gentle voices so as not to make a spectacle of grief. One set piece appeared again and again on local broadcasts, the road sign, South Road, and the line of trees behind it, as if the trees might tell you what the people inside could not. For Whitney's family, every headline carried a second sting because of what they say she tried to tell people. Warnings not so different from the ones advocates hear every day. He's getting worse. It's my fault when he's like this. I've got a plan to leave, I just need to do it right. That is the terrible math of domestic violence. The leaving is often the most dangerous part. Threats sharpen when control is challenged. The grip tightens. When it senses a loosening, the system is better than it was a generation ago. Orders of protection, lethality assessments, shelter networks, phone-based safety planning. But in the space between a phone call and a patrol car, a life can still disappear. And yet Whitney called. Imagine that courage. Imagine the quick scan of possibilities in a brain running hot with adrenaline. If I call, he'll hear. If I don't call, what happens next? She chose to reach out. That's not the story of a passive victim. That's the story of an active choice under pressure, a choice we ask people to make and then must be ready to meet with speed and weight. Law enforcement did move fast. They reached the house. They made a call at the line between de-escalation and protection. They captured the suspect alive. But 3 lives were already over. By the time daylight washed over South Road, investigators had already pulled the house into a grid. Entry path, exterior shell casings, interior trajectories, the sharp geometry of a family's last minutes. What came next was the slower work, pulling thread by thread through the past to see where the weave first frayed. Reports documented at least 2 prior calls for domestic disturbance at the address in recent years. Officers clearing after tempers cooled, no arrests made, the kind of outcomes that leave a warning on paper and a bruise you can't always see. Friends said Whitney had begun to name what was happening. Control masked as concern. Apologies that came with conditions. Doors slammed like punctuation. She'd confided to more than one person that she was preparing to leave, carefully, because everyone knows leaving is the point at which danger sharpens. The 911 audio would later confirm what the dispatcher heard in real time. Whitney's voice steady but urgent. A request for help, a few half-formed details. He's been drinking, there's a gun, and then the percussive punctuation of shots. Between those sounds were seconds that seemed to slow down in retrospect, as if time itself tried to wedge a shoulder into the doorway and stop what was about to happen. There are always 2 clocks in cases like this, the official one that stamps reports, and the private one kept by the people inside the house, measuring courage, fear, and the length of a hallway from one life to another. At arraignment, prosecutors laid out the first pass of the state's case: 3 killings inside the family home, a rifle recovered at the scene, statements that placed Joshua outside with the weapon when patrol cars arrived, a decision by officers to use tasers rather than deadly force to disarm him. The counts were stark: one count of first-degree murder and multiple counts of second-degree murder, plus weapons possession, and bail was denied. In cuffs and jail blues, Joshua stood mute except to assert not guilty. His public defender reserved all motions. Outside, the air had that washed pine smell after rain, a sensory detail that made the courthouse steps feel indecently ordinary. Whitney's people started piecing together her final plans from texts and calendars. There was a note in her phone labeled "Get Out," a list of mundane and monumental tasks in the same small font: pack birth certificate, photograph valuables, cash for 2 weeks, ask aunt about spare room. She'd already changed passwords, banking, email, a social app or two, and saved screenshots of threatening messages in a folder named Insurance. She'd reached out to a hotline, kept the call short, memorized a safety plan for the night she would go, and she'd told 3 people something that now rings in the throat. If anything happens, it's because I tried. People who loved Wilson and Anita built their own private timelines because the violence didn't stop at Whitney. He was the steady father who kept a freezer of venison labeled by month and cut, the person who left spare fuses in a coffee can on the basement shelf. She was the grandmother who folded towels into perfect thirds and always slipped a $5 bill into a birthday card, more for the ritual than the amount. They were present in that house in the most ordinary way, watching, advising, intervening where they could. What happened to them happened because they were there when the fuse burned down. In the thick of it, the legal language started to stack: protective orders, predicate acts, extreme depravity elements. But the human language was simpler and harder. A friend said Whitney had started parking her car nose out for a quick exit. She had packed a go bag and hid it behind the coats. She had told her boss she might miss a shift for family stuff and asked whether direct deposit could be split into 2 accounts just in case. She wasn't waiting for someone else to rescue her. She was building an escape ladder rung by rung. It did not get her past the window in time. Investigators compiled a timeline that, from their point of view, was clear. A conflict turned lethal, 3 family members dead, and a suspect disarmed without further loss of life. But law enforcement also had to knot that timeline to prior contacts, earlier calls at the address, any documented injuries, the paper trail of wellness checks and warnings. On that score, the record showed what so many records show: moments of intervention that did not tip the scale, a system that can be quick at the end and ponderous in the middle. What helps now is the part no report can carry: the voice of the person who knew and did not look away. One neighbor remembered Whitney standing in the checkout line at the small market in town, staring too long at the magazine rack as if reading was a way to borrow a minute. A cousin remembered Whitney calling to ask about a spare air mattress because things might get weird. A coworker remembered Whitney switching from laughing to quiet in the space of a ringtone when a particular name flashed on her screen. None of these moments are evidence, but all of them are truth. As the case moved toward grand jury and discovery deadlines, defense counsel began to sketch the contours of their argument: mental health, substance use, a claim that the sequence of shots told a story other than premeditation. Prosecutors, in turn, leaned into the 911 call, the recovered weapon, and the testimony of first responders who watched a man pace in the yard with a rifle while 3 people lay dying or already dead. Somewhere between those lines, the trial will separate fact from story, motive from explanation, and make a choice about what the law calls this kind of night. Meanwhile, Whitney's warnings kept echoing in conversations with advocates who know the shape of these narratives. They pointed to patterns: escalation around separation, firearms in the home increasing lethality, past calls that do not predict but do foreshadow. They talked about lethality assessments, Short checklists that ask simple questions with life or death answers. Has he ever threatened to kill you? Has he ever tried to strangle you? Is there a gun? Did the violence escalate when you left or tried to leave? Whitney had begun, in her own way, to fill out that checklist with actions. Money set aside, documents gathered, a call placed. The house on South Road became a landmark for a while, cars slowing, strangers driving by in quiet pilgrimage, people leaving a bouquet or a folded note with a sentence you would never say in person because it is too blunt. I'm sorry we didn't hear you loud enough. The tape came down. The evidence markers were boxed and logged. The porch bulb was replaced, and still the air around that place felt thinner, like the mountain had leaned a degree to one side. The courtroom in Troy felt too small for what it had to hold. Fluorescents hummed. A bailiff's shoes clicked like a metronome. When the judge took the bench, people who had loved Whitney, Wilson, and Anita leaned forward as if posture alone could keep the proceeding from drifting into legal abstraction. Joshua Fowler stood at counsel table beside two public defenders. He wore jail blues and the fixed expression of someone trying to learn the etiquette of catastrophe, when to look up, when to keep eyes on the table's faux wood grain. The clerk read the charges one by one count of first-degree murder, 3 counts of second-degree murder, and criminal possession of a weapon. He answered not guilty, the 2 most practiced words in American courtrooms. Bail denied. The state outlined its spine, a 6:36 p.m. domestic violence 911 call from the Grafton house on South Road. Gunshots captured on the open line. Troopers arriving minutes later to find Whitney dead outside, and inside, Wilson and Anita shot and beyond help. The defendant found in the yard with a long gun, refusing commands, subdued by tasers. The weapon, prosecutors said, was a semi-automatic rifle legally owned by Joshua's father, taken from where the family had kept it. One prosecutor added what had already seeped into public reporting. This was not the first time police had been called to that address. Prior disturbance calls, no arrests. The pattern is familiar to any advocate who works these cases. A file dotted with false stops that, in hindsight, look like mile markers. The defense reserved motions but set its early themes: intoxication, mental health stressors, the claim that shots fired in rapid sequence tell a different story than premeditation. They bristled when the state referenced post-arrest statements that alluded to wanting police to end it, an echo of what troopers had suggested: suicide by cop. The judge, calm and clipped, told both sides to put their disagreements into paper and deadlines, a motion schedule, a discovery conference, the next chess moves committed to calendar ink instead of hallway murmurs. Names entered the record that would now travel with the case: assistant district attorneys tasked with telling the story for the dead, a judge tasked with refereeing process and language, the public defenders who must insist on burdens and proof even when the facts seem to shout. Behind every name sat people who knew the family as more than a case caption, a sister who remembered Whitney's laugh as the exact pitch of a porch wind chime, a friend who could still feel the press of Anita's hand when she said grace at Thanksgiving, a cousin who swore Wilson never forgot to check the oil in anyone's car. The 911 audio was the emotional center. The judge ruled it admissible, subject to limiting instruction, not as proof of everything, but as a record of the moment the state says the line between argument and murder was crossed. Jurors will hear a young woman keep her voice steady while asking for help in a place where she should not have had to ask. They will hear shots. They will hear the messy silence that follows violence. A phone still connected, air moving, the world not yet aware of what it now contains. Outside the courtroom, advocates talked about lethality. They used the quiet language of checklists, recent separation or plans to leave, presence of firearms, past strangulation, threats of suicide or homicide. escalating jealousy. You don't need every box checked for risk to spike. One checked box, is there a gun, can move the needle by itself. People closest to Whitney say she was taking steps, passwords changed, cash set aside, a place to go, a bag tucked where it wouldn't be noticed. That is not indecision. That is planning under threat. It is also the moment when danger often peaks. Inside the well of the court, the law converted all of that into sentences and exhibits. Investigators mapped the floor plan, dotted it with trajectories, distances, and times. A forensic tech described the rifle's make and model, the recovered shell casings, the path of officers' approach when they chose conducted energy devices over sidearms, because there was still a chance to prevent further death. A trooper testified to the arrival time, within minutes of the call, and how quickly the yard turned from menace to control once the weapon dropped and bodies in uniform closed the distance. Another marked where they found Whitney's phone, screen cracked, call timer still counting when someone hit end. In another hearing, the state sought an order of protection for the one surviving household member who still needed the court's shield, a routine step that nevertheless felt like an important sentence said out loud. The judge granted it without fuss. Defense lawyers noted, for the record, that their client was being held with no contact allowed. The point mattered mostly to the transcript, which is a kind of memory the law keeps for itself. The town kept its own memory. South Road turned into a place people slowed down passing, not for morbid curiosity, but because you cannot help but look at a house after it has been named. Flowers came and withered and came again. A handmade sign said, "Whitney warned us," the words both accusation and elegy. In the grocery store, someone told the cashier to keep the change and put it toward any neighbor who needed a gas card to get out fast. A church basement hosted a training led by a local shelter. How to safety plan, how to ask the right questions, how to hear the meaning behind "I'm fine." At the next status conference, the judge addressed scheduling in a level voice. The state said the grand jury had returned an indictment that tracked the initial charges. The defense previewed a suppression motion and a request to sever counts. The court took it under advisement. In the gallery, a hand squeezed another and held on. Trials move slowly, even when lives have ended quickly. That is part of justice's promise and its ache. We do not let haste write the history, even when grief begs us to. Still, for all the legal pacing, certain facts had already hardened. 3 people were dead inside a family home. A call for help was answered too late to save them, but in time to prevent more deaths and to arrest a defendant alive. The weapon was in evidence. The timeline was in minutes. The prior calls were in the file. And Whitney's warnings, spilled across text threads and whispered at kitchen tables, were now part of a public record that could not look away. The calendar took over where the sirens left off. In Rensselaer County Court, the judge set a schedule as precise as a metronome. Motions by mid-August, responses 2 weeks later, arguments to follow. Paperwork moved in packets, suppression challenges on statements Joshua allegedly made after arrest, a defense bid to exclude portions of the 911 recording, a state memorandum to admit prior domestic disturbance contacts as context. The law's vocabulary is cold on purpose. It steadies the hands that must write history. Through it all, 3 names stayed in the room like quiet witnesses. Whitney Fowler, 27, her father-in-law Wilson, 55, and Anita Crandall, 69. The charges remained what they were the morning after the killings: 1 count of first-degree murder, 3 counts of second-degree murder, and a weapons count. The state's spine stayed the same too. Whitney's 6:36 p.m. call reporting an altercation, gunshots heard on the open line, troopers arriving within minutes to find Whitney dead outside, Wilson and Anita shot inside, and Joshua in the yard with a semi-automatic rifle before he was subdued with tasers. In his first appearance, he said the only 2 words defendants have at that stage: not guilty. What changed was the view. The case shifted from first report to first principles. What did the Constitution allow in the interview room? Where does evidence end and prejudice begin, while the community kept speaking the human half of the record? People who knew Whitney described a young woman who had started doing everything safety plans recommend: changing passwords, stashing cash, nose-out parking, a go bag hidden behind coats, a note in her phone titled "Get Out," with items ranging from birth certificates to spare car keys. Friends said she had already asked about a spare room and split direct deposit just in case. Those details mattered because they explained a clock that doesn't show up in discovery, the dangerous countdown that starts when a person in danger begins to leave. Prosecutors told the court they would seek to play the 911 recording for jurors. Whitney's steady voice, the request for help, and then the concussive punctuation of shots. The defense signaled it would argue intoxication, mental health stressors, and a narrative of rapid, chaotic firing inconsistent with premeditation. They also bristled at the state's suggestion that Joshua had angled for suicide by cop in the yard. They called the phrase inflammatory and sought to keep it out. The judge kept counsel to deadlines and reminded both sides that what jurors hear must be anchored to rules, not rumor. Outside court, the measures of grief were smaller and more legible. A cousin showed reporters the list Whitney kept, items checked off, others undone. At the market, the clerk who used to see Whitney staring too long at the magazine rack now held cash out to anyone who whispered they needed to get somewhere safe. A church basement hosted a lethality assessment training with a shelter advocate. Short questions with long shadows. Has he ever threatened to kill you? Has he tried to strangle you? Is there a gun? Has the violence escalated since you talked about leaving? People took handouts and wrote hotline numbers on the inside of their wrists before heading back into the ordinary light of day. The state also asked for something that seemed procedural but felt important: an order of protection for the one surviving household member, tied to the home, but not present during the shootings. It was granted without fanfare. The attorney list grew longer: assistant district attorneys, public defenders, victim assistance coordinators, and with it the sense that a whole lattice of people now existed to carry pieces of a story that had begun as one voice on one call. Every hearing returned in some way to the geometry of the house. Floor plans were annotated with arrows and measurements. A ballistics tech marked where casings fell and where the dog-eared area rug had bunched under a boot. A trooper traced his path up the drive, weapon low, taser ready, recounting the split-second calculus of approaching a man with a rifle, while 3 relatives lay motionless within shouting distance. He said they chose electricity over bullets because they believed the moment allowed it. The choice spared more funerals. It also guaranteed a trial. Whitney's name kept showing up in ways that made it feel less like a headline and more like a hand on your shoulder. Co-workers remembered how she would brighten a room and then dim if a certain ringtone chimed. A neighbor said she once saw Whitney standing at her mailbox, reading a letter twice, then tucking it deep into her coat as if to protect it from the sky. A friend shared a text: "If anything happens, it's because I tried." You can build a case out of diagrams. You build memory out of sentences like that. No one pretended the earlier calls to the South Road address were proof of what was to come. But they did what prior contacts always do in a domestic violence file. They sketched a pattern of volatility and fear that advocates recognized as risk. In public briefings, officials repeated what they always repeat after nights like June 18th. If you are in danger, call. If you suspect someone is in danger, call. If you're not sure, call anyway. People did call more than usual, the hotline said, and a few of those calls ended with someone stepping into a borrowed room, clutching a bag packed days earlier and a future scribbled on a legal pad. By late summer, the case had a courtroom rhythm. Motions were argued. The judge reserved decision on some, ruled from the bench on others, and penciled in a pre-trial conference for the fall. Reporters filed stories about what the law calls procedural posture, the kind of phrase that lands dull on a page until you remember each posture holds 3 absent faces. The defense sought to narrow the story to seconds and synapses. The prosecution worked to widen it back to weeks and warnings. Somewhere between those frames, a jury will one day be asked to fix a name to what happened: premeditation, extreme depravity, or something the penal code calls by a different number. And still, away from the docket, life gathered itself. The mailbox on South Road filled and emptied. Someone mowed the strip of grass by the ditch. In the evening, the tree line blackened against a sky that looked exactly like it did before the gunshots. You could drive past and swear the world had gone back to what it was. It hadn't. It never does. The people who loved Whitney, Wilson, and Anita learned the town's map by another layer now. Where the first cruiser stopped, where the tape hung, where a phone lay face down but connected long enough to put the truth on record. This is where the story must rest for now, with the case awaiting trial, with motions filed and dates set, with an open line that still seems to hum in the quiet parts of the day. Whitney did what we beg people to do. She warned, she planned, she called. The system arrived quickly and still too late. 3 lives ended. 1 stands in a courtroom to answer for it. Between those facts lives the work left to everyone else: to hear warnings the first time, to treat "I'm leaving" as a storm siren, and to make sure the next person who dials finds a future waiting on the other end of the line. Thank you for watching The Witness Record. If Whitney's story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next case. Stay safe, stay attentive, and keep speaking up for those who can't.